I had a feeling that some of the tools that we use in our line of work ought to be given away, exported, that anyone could profit from better intuitions about probability and logic and Bayesian reasoning, namely calibrating your degree of credence in a hypothesis to the strength of the evidence, game theory. These are just mental tools that everyone should command. I didn't know of any course that packaged them all in one curriculum. There are a lot of courses on statistics and probability, but they tend not to have logic in the same curriculum or game theory. But of course, as soon as I mention to people I'm going to be teaching a course on rationality, the inevitable question is, why does humanity seem to be losing its mind? So it was adventitiously timely, topical, and I, of course, couldn't avoid that topic, and it does make up one of the chapters of the book called What's Wrong with People.
Exactly, yeah. I guess sitting here as a mathematician, you're slightly preaching to the converted as far as I'm concerned, because you know I kind of rationality is really the way that I think. And I particularly liked there was a quote you used of Leibniz, which I think is my kind of philosophy of life, that the only way to rectify our reasonings is to make them as tangible as those of the mathematicians, so that we can find our error at a glance. And when there are disputes among persons, we can simply say, let us calculate without further ado and see who is right. So why am I doomed to failure in trying to reduce everybody to calculations?
So Leibniz's logical utopia, in which any disagreement could be settled by deduction, is not with us for a number of reasons. One of them is that a lot of our knowledge doesn't consist of propositions that are true or false and implications that necessarily follow from them, which is the stuff of classical logic, but consist of large numbers of probabilistic cues that we kind of add up and weight, put into context. In logic, people often ask me, what's the difference between logic and reason, or logic and rationality? Logic is just one of the tools of rationality. And to do logic, you have to do something that can often be quite irrational, namely forget everything you know and concentrate only on what's stated in the premises. You forget the entirety of your world knowledge. That's what makes logic and indeed academic thinking so foreign to people who haven't been immersed in schooling, non-Western peoples, children, where it never makes sense to forget everything you know in real life. But that's exactly what you have to do in logic. So if the syllogism that you're asked to validate is all plant products are healthy, tobacco is a plant product, therefore tobacco is healthy. Now that is a valid syllogism, but people get it wrong because they can't get out of their head, tobacco healthy? What are you kidding? Now, of course, that is highly relevant to anything you have to do in the world, but in terms of the task stated as a logic problem, it gets you the wrong answer. And so logic is obviously an indispensable tool. Computers are basically logic and silicon, and there are cases in which you really do want to forget and concentrate only on what's stipulated in the premises. In legal reasoning, for example, you may want to deliberately blind yourself to prejudicial factors like the race of the defendant. In biology, sometimes you want to forget about superficial similarities. So you can call a porpoise a mammal instead of a fish, where it's closer to a deductive system. So in formal science and in formal law, you do want the gift of forgetting the entirety of your knowledge and concentrating on the premises. But generally in everyday life, that would be a foolish thing to do.
I think the other point that you make in the book, which is, I think, relevant to this, was that, you know, as a mathematician, when I'm trying to prove a theorem, I have to define things very explicitly, and so that definition will absolutely pin down the object that I'm trying to prove something about. But actually, trying to pin down the definition of things that we use in everyday language is often a real problem. I mean, you talk about Wittgenstein's attempt to try and define what a game is. So you're trying to prove something, reduce it to a mathematical, logical proof, but actually you can't pin down in language what a game is. I mean, is that one of our problems? That sort of,
and that's another reason why logic in the formal sense is often kind of useless for everyday reasoning. So game is an example, and vegetable. Now, of course, there are domains of thinking in which we do have to stipulate rules and ascertain whether a fuzzy category fits the definition. For example, did Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky have sex? Now, sex is a fuzzy family resemblance category. On the other hand, the law has to deal with stipulated formal logical rules just so that the guilt and innocence aren't up to the whim of a judge. And a lot of legalistic reasoning consists of trying to shoehorn our fuzzy probabilistic concepts into these classical categories that have necessary and sufficient conditions.
I guess you talked about Kahneman quite a lot in the book, and his ideas of the fact that we have these two systems of thinking seem to be the sort of difficulty that some people are having with applying rationality, that our first kind of reaction, our intuitive idea about how to solve a problem is often not the right one. We need to slow down, thinking fast and slow. And the slow version is applying our kind of analytic model. So is this kind of a sort of battle between these two sorts of thinking that we have in our brain, that we use this system one, the fast intuitive, which often just is wrong, and we have to slow down to do this kind of rationalism.
Indeed, and we can be fooled by certain intuitions that don't apply to a particular case. Another example from that style of question is if there are lily pads on a pond that double every day, and after 30 days the pond is completely covered, on what day will it be half covered? People say, well, first inclination is 15, then maybe they adjust upward a little bit, 16 or 17. The answer, of course, is day 29, because if it doubles every day and it's full on the 30th day, then it was half covered on the 29th day. It's an example of how exponential growth is surprisingly unintuitive, and it does, even though that might sound like a trick question, a gotcha, there are many cases in everyday life in which a failure to appreciate exponential growth has real consequences, such as people don't save early enough for retirement. Even a small amount of money invested early on, because of compound interest, which grows exponentially, can give you quite the nest egg by the time you're ready for retirement. Or conversely, people who take out credit card loans, where the credit card company charges interest on the interest, can quickly wipe out a life savings. Another example, and this is one that afflicts even experts, even the kind of person, I'm not going to name any names, but two different experts on statistical reasoning and its and the fallacies that people made themselves committed fallacy. When early in the days of the COVID pandemic, they said, well, the rate of death from COVID is comparable to strep throat, to the flu, to other things that we tolerate without shutting down society. You're much more likely to be killed in a car crash. It's a familiar trope in experts on human